Hey, class. Happy Thursday. Wow, you've made it through the week. Good job. All right, well, today we're going to talk about solving equations that have radicals in them. What's a radical? What is that? Hey, duh. Well, a radical is a square root. That's just a fancy name for a square root. It could also be a cubed root or other kinds of roots. But normally when we say radical, we mean a square root. So you can see here, this is a worksheet similar to the one you're going to be assigned. And we'll work through some of these equations that have square roots. So let's go ahead and start our notes. Okay, so today is Wednesday. No, let me correct that. Today is Thursday, March 25th. And actually, I'm pre-recording this. So when you see this, it will be Thursday. But right now, it's still Wednesday. Unit 8, square roots and exponents. Day 5, solving radical equations. What does radical mean? That's just another word for square root. And square root just means undoing a square power. Undoing a power or an exponent. Next week we'll be talking about exponents. So it's good for you to learn this vocabulary in terms of exponents. What does squaring mean? Who remembers that? That means that you multiply something by itself. If I square 5, it's 5 times 5. All right, let's go ahead and look at some steps. Let's go back to this example over here. If I have an equation like this, the square root of b equals 5, how do I undo that? Well, what is the opposite of square root? The opposite is squaring. So all we do is we just square both sides. So I'm going to square the square root, and I'm going to square 5. This is something you could probably do in your head for a simple equation like this. But it's still good to write down just to get in the flow of solving equations and balancing. So the square and the square root cancel each other out, and you're just left with b. Okay. 5 squared is 25. And that's your answer. You might think, Mr. John, isn't there 2 answers? No, 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 no. That number has a square root over it, not a square. So it has to be positive. What comes out has to be positive. If you take the square root of a negative number, it's called an imaginary number. And we're not dealing with imaginary numbers today. We're in the real world. We're keeping it real. Okay, so look at this one here. The square root of x equals 8. How would you do that? Square both sides. Let's cancel out. And x is going to equal what? It's going to equal 64. Good. Or 8 squared. I hope you've learned your perfect squares at this point. All right, now we're going to look at some other problems that require a little bit more work. Whoa, look at all these. So I'm going to go back to the notes, and I hope you're taking notes too. In order to solve a radical equation, first thing you want to do is go ahead and first thing, let's go ahead and get the square root by itself. I'm just going to put SQRT, squirt, that means square root. Get the square root by itself. In other words, you're going to solve for the square root. So let's go ahead and do that with, we're going to look at this problem down here if you want to follow along. I'm going to erase. So if you can do this one, if you can do number 6, you can do any of them. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that plus 10 that's on the outside. How do we get rid of plus 10? We subtract 10. Okay. And subtract 10 on both sides. And these cancel out. 10 minus 10 is 0. 16 minus 10 is 6. So we just completed our first step. All right, now let's look at the next step. Next step, now that you have the square root by itself, second thing, is you want to get rid of the square root by squaring it. So square both sides. Square both sides of the equation. Oops, I put the S in the wrong spot. Square both sides. All right. And so let's go ahead and do that. So we have, let's see if I can scroll up a little bit. Okay. We have 6 equals the square root of n minus 5. All right. If I square 6, it gives us 36. And if we square a square root, they cancel each other out. Notice the square root has to be positive. When I square it, it's going to still be positive. But if there had been a negative on the outside, we would have wanted to move that. All right. So we have n minus 5. Okay, now we're down to our last step. So last step's pretty straightforward, I hope. So on the last step, just solve for your variable. Solve for x. Solve for our variable. Variable is not always x, but it's just kind of the generic word we use for any variable. How do we solve? Well, just like we did when we did 1-step, 2-step, and multiple step equations. Just like before. We do the opposite operation on the opposite side. So I have n minus 5. How do I get rid of the minus 5? We add 5. All right? Just going to add 5 to both sides. And on this side, that means they cancel out, and we're just left with n. On the other side, we're going to get a sum of 41. 36 plus 5 is 41. So our answer is going to be 41 equals n. You notice I only have one answer. For these kind of radical equations with square roots in them, you're going to either have one answer or you're going to have no answers. It's possible to have no real answers. Okay, I just want to show you one last thing since we have a little bit of time. Here's a graph of the square root of x. So watch what happens whenever I add on the outside. When I add on the outside, it scoots up. When I subtract on the outside, it goes down. When we add on the inside, what do you think is going to happen? I'm just going to put plus c. Well, when we add on the inside a positive, it moves to the left. When we add a negative, which means subtracting, it moves to the right. Because that x has to be bigger to compensate. But what do you notice we don't see? We don't ever see anything on the negative side of the graph. If I add 1, the x could be negative 1, because negative 1 plus 1 is 0. But what we can never have is under the square root a negative, unless we're dealing with the complex number system, which you won't this year. All right, what happens if we multiply or divide? Well, if I multiply on the inside, let's say I'm going to multiply by negative 2. It flipped to the other side. But now we don't have anything on the positive side, because if x was positive, then you would have a negative under the square root. Let's say it was positive 5. That would be negative 2 times 5. That'd be the square root of negative 10, which is a no-go. But if we have negative 5, negative 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, and that's okay. All right, hope you guys are doing well, and we'll see you next time. Bye.